She accidentally goes into heat after inhaling human pheromones. And her body starts changing. The air on the frontier station was stale, recycled 1,000 times over. But none of that mattered to Kira. She stood at the observation window of the medical wing, arms crossed tightly over her chest as her silver blue eyes tracked the ship docking on the far side of the bay. Another human transport, more supplies. More of them. She exhaled through her nose and turned away, the faint flutter of unease in her chest quickly buried under the practiced indifference she wore like armor. She was a Xeranth, second born of the high bloodline, trained as a biologist and healer. She had worked her entire life to prove that she did not need anyone's help, least of all from a race as chaotic and reckless as humans. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and they carried with them pheromones her people had studied and cataloged, noting their influence on lesser species with clinical detachment. But Xeranth were immune, they were disciplined, above such primitive instincts. At least that was what she told herself. The human was already inside the medical lab by the time she returned to her duties. He was tall for his species, with dark hair and deep green eyes that scanned his surroundings with casual interest, as if this state of the Art Xeranth facility was merely another stop along his route. He wore the standard Alliance jumpsuit, dark blue with the emblem of his rank on his chest. His name was stitched into the fabric in Terran script. Dane Keller. He smelled strange. She frowned, adjusting the filters in the air circulation system as he approached the counter where she was scanning samples. The faintest whiff of something sharp and warm lingered in her senses, making her pulse tick up for no reason she could explain. She scowled at the sensation and turned to face him, expression perfectly neutral. "You're late," she said. "Traffic." He replied with a half smile that showed his teeth but wasn't hostile. "Your security checks are thorough." "Necessary," she countered, not looking away. His gaze was steady, calm in a way that didn't make sense for his species. Most humans were jittery, overflowing with energy. This one was still. It unsettled her. He held out a data pad. "Delivery manifest. Need your confirmation." She took it, fingers brushing his hand by accident. The contact was brief, bare skin against skin for the span of a heartbeat. But the sensation that shot through her was not brief. It lingered, thrumming through her system like an electric pulse that made her spine stiffen and her stomach twist sharply. Her breath hitched, but she covered it by turning abruptly toward the console. "Wait there," she ordered, voice clipped. Her hands moved faster than necessary as she processed the manifest, trying to focus on the words instead of the heat blooming under her skin. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, heavy and fast, and her skin prickled along the ridges of her crest. She didn't like this. She didn't like him, but her body was responding as if it had no say in the matter. Dane didn't move from his spot. His presence was heavy in the room. Even when he was silent, she could still smell him, and the more she inhaled, the worse it got. Her pulse spiked again, and something deep in her core twisted sharply, making her grip the edge of the console tighter than she intended. The temperature was rising. No, not the room, her. Something was wrong. She pressed her wrist to the scanner to sign off on the cargo and turned back toward him. She meant to hand him the pad without meeting his eyes. But she did. And when she did, something inside her cracked. He frowned. "Right. I need you to leave," she said tightly, though her voice came out hoarse. Her mouth was dry, her skin was flushed, a soft shimmer of heat glistening on the exposed curves of her throat. She cursed herself silently for forgetting to wear her filtration collar this morning. His gaze softened, but he stepped back. "Okay, leaving now." He turned toward the exit, and for one terrible moment, she thought it was over. But it wasn't. The door hissed open and the fresh air from the corridor blasted into the lab, carrying with it more of his scent, stronger now, like warm metal and something rich she couldn't identify. It hit her like a punch. Her knees buckled. She caught herself on the counter, but not fast enough to stop the sound that escaped her throat. A low, desperate whimper. He stopped, slowly turned. His eyes widened. "Kira?" She hated him for saying her name. Hated that it sounded right on his lips. But when she tried to tell him to get out, no words came. Her body betrayed her completely. A wave of heat rolled through her, starting at her core and spreading out like fire under her skin. Her breathing turned shallow, desperate. Her legs felt weak. She was going into heat. It wasn't possible. Not with him. Not with any human. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. Her body was preparing itself, whether she wanted it or not. Her skin was hotter now, glowing faintly with the flush of arousal that crested against every nerve. The scent of her own pheromones, normally suppressed and controlled, now filled the air in a heady mixture she could already see him reacting to. He stepped forward, slowly, hands raised like he was approaching something fragile or dangerous. "Kira," he said again, low and steady, "what's happening?" She squeezed her eyes shut. "You need to leave." "I'm not leaving you like this." His voice was rougher now, his breathing heavier. He could smell her. That much was obvious. She opened her eyes and met his gaze. He wasn't mocking her. He wasn't afraid. There was something else there. Something primal and impossibly patient. She didn't understand it. She couldn't control it. Her body was demanding something she had never experienced, never wanted. But now it was overwhelming. Her claws bit into the console. The faintest sound of metal groaning under her grip. Her crest flushed fully now, ridges softening, and her pupils dilated. He was too close. She could feel the heat of him even from where he stood. Her mouth opened, and this time, the words that came out weren't a command. "Touch me." He froze. His chest rose and fell heavily. "Are you sure?" She wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the question. Of course she wasn't sure. She was out of her mind. Her biology was overriding everything she thought she knew about control. But her body didn't care about reason. "I can't stop it," she admitted, her voice breaking on the last word. "My body, it's changing." She saw something shift in his expression then. Not pity, not fear. Something hotter. She smelled it before she saw it, the sudden sharp increase in his own pheromones. It hit her like a wave, driving another low moan from her throat. He crossed the room in 2 strides, and before she could think, his hands were on her hips, steadying her as her knees finally gave out. His touch was hot, firm, gentle. She hated how good it felt, hated that it made her shiver. "You're okay," he murmured, his lips near her temple. "We'll figure this out." Her hands found his shoulders without thinking, claws retracting so she wouldn't hurt him. His skin was solid under her grip, warm. He smelled like danger and safety both at once. Her mind was a haze, but one thing was clear. She needed him, needed something only he could give. Her body was adapting, whether she wanted it to or not. She could feel it happening. The heat wasn't just arousal. It was biological imperative. Her cells were reconfiguring themselves to be compatible with him, with his DNA. Her people had theorized about the possibility, but it had never happened before. Not in all their history. And it was happening to her. She pressed her forehead against his chest, trying to steady herself. His hand slid up her spine, careful and slow. The contact sent another ripple through her body. She whimpered again, frustration and need tangled into one unbearable knot. "Kira," he said softly. "Tell me what to do." She didn't have the words. She tilted her head back and kissed him. His lips were warm, firm against hers. He responded instantly, his arms tightening around her as he deepened the kiss, his breath hot against her cheek. Her fingers slid into his hair, gripping tightly as the last of her restraint dissolved completely. Her body molded against his, hunger and heat driving every move. Her people would call it madness. She didn't care. Her body was changing, and there was no going back. When they finally broke the kiss, both of them were panting. His eyes searched hers, questioning. She licked her lips, tasking him there. "I need more," she whispered. "No." And he didn't hesitate. They stumbled together toward the med bay cot, a blur of hands and mouths, heat and need. Clothes were stripped away, bodies exposed. She saw the awe in his gaze as he looked at her, touched her, as if she were something precious instead of something broken. Her body responded to every touch, every sound he made. She could feel the shift inside her, her cells adapting further, making her ready for something more profound than instinct, for something permanent. And as he finally entered her, she realized the truth. She wasn't just going into heat. She was bonding, and there was no turning back. The dim lights of the med bay flickered faintly, casting long shadows along the smooth metal walls. Kira's breathing was ragged, her body still trembling as she lay tangled in the sheets, her skin slick with a sheen of heat that hadn't abated. Her pulse pounded in her ears, fast and heavy, but not from fear. No, that feeling had been replaced with something far more dangerous. Desire, urgency, and something deeper. Something she was barely able to process in the haze of what her body was becoming. Dane's fingers brushed along the line of her jaw, gentle in contrast to the possessive grip he'd held on her hips just moments earlier. His thumb swept over her cheek as if he were memorizing the feel of her. His breathing was uneven too, his chest rising and falling in time with hers. She could feel his heartbeat now, not just under her hand where it rested on his chest, but inside her own, as if his life force was merging with hers, something more profound than anything she had ever experienced or been taught to expect. She dragged her gaze to his, those green eyes catching hers and holding them as if he could see right into her mind. His lips were parted slightly, and he looked concerned. No, protective, like he was watching over something fragile, something his instincts wouldn't allow him to abandon. Kira wasn't used to being the one protected. Her people were warriors, survivors, and she was Xeranth. The strong did not show weakness, but she didn't feel weak now. Her body had accepted him, and because of that, something new was growing inside her. She could feel it in the heat pooling low in her abdomen. The change wasn't over. Not yet. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his voice rough but calm. She closed her eyes, fighting the urge to push him down again and lose herself in him completely. She needed clarity. She needed answers. And she needed to understand what her body was demanding. "You're not leaving," she murmured. It wasn't a question, but his lips quirked at the corners anyway. "Didn't plan on it." Kira sat up slowly, the sheets falling away from her shoulders. Dane's gaze flickered down briefly, his pupils dilating, but he kept his hands where they were. She was grateful for that small show of restraint, because her control was hanging by a thread. The air between them was thick with pheromones, hers his. It was impossible to tell them apart now. They were tangled together in the most primal way, and every instinct inside her told her to complete the bond fully. But this wasn't about instinct. Not anymore. "This isn't supposed to happen," she said after a long silence, staring at the diagnostic screen hovering near the cot. It showed her vitals, elevated heart rate, fluctuating hormone levels, bioelectric field destabilized and reforming. "Or species aren't compatible. We shouldn't be able to," she trailed off, unable to say it. "Then why can we?" Dane asked quietly. She turned toward him sharply. "I don't know." But she did know. Her people's scientists had theorized for centuries that human biology was dangerously adaptable, that it could integrate foreign elements, even across species boundaries. What they hadn't considered, what Kira hadn't believed until this moment, was that it worked both ways. Her body wasn't rejecting him. It was adapting to him, craving him. "You think this was because of my pheromones," he said, not accusing, just stating the fact she was already chewing over. "Yes," she admitted. "No, it's not just that. Something else is happening. My cells, they're changing." He nodded slowly. "I felt it too." Her head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing. "I can feel you," Dane said, placing his hand over his chest. "Not just physically. Deeper. Like you're in here?" Kira's pulse skipped. She reached out, laying her palm flat against his skin. The warmth was immediate, familiar in a way it had no right to be. And then she felt it. The echo of herself inside him. Her essence, not just pheromones, but her life force. Her energy was merging with his, binding them. The implications were staggering. "We're bonding," she whispered. "A true bond." Dane's brows furrowed. "Is that permanent?" She nodded slowly, her throat tight. "Yes." They sat in silence for a moment, both processing the weight of what had already happened between them. This was beyond a physical need. This was biological destiny. And it wasn't finished. Kira slid off the cot, her bare feet touching the cold floor. Her legs were shaky, but she stood anyway, grabbing her uniform from the chair nearby. She slipped it over her shoulders, shivering at the contrast of fabric against her overheated skin. Dane watched her, his gaze dark with emotion she couldn't name. "We have to figure out what this means," she said, securing the collar of her uniform at her throat. "For me. For you. For us," Dane said quietly. Her chest ached at the word. "Us?" She didn't correct him. The comm panel on the wall lit up with a soft chime, and Kira swore under her breath. She walked over and keyed it on, forcing her expression back to something neutral even as her skin still hummed with the aftershocks of their bond. "Kira, report," came the curt voice of Commander Threx. She took a steadying breath. "Medical intake complete. The human cargo agent has delivered supplies as expected." There was a pause. "Understood." Report for debriefing at 17. The comm went dark. Kira exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping. Dane rose from the cot, pulling his jumpsuit back on with efficient movements. I guess this isn't going away. No, she said. It's not. And then she felt it. Another wave of heat rolling through her body, not as intense as before, but enough to make her knees weaken. She gripped the edge of the console to steady herself, and Dane was at her side instantly, his hand at her back. Still happening? He asked. She nodded tightly. It's not stopping. My body is still adapting. He slid his arm around her waist, his touch gentle but steady. What do we do? She looked at him. This human who had somehow become the center of her universe in less than a day. We survive it. Dane smiled faintly. That's what I'm good at. Kira leaned into him for just a moment, drawing strength from the connection that was quickly becoming the only stable thing in her world. Then she straightened, pulling away reluctantly. You need to leave the med bay. I'm not leaving you alone like this, he said, and there was steel in his voice now. She sighed. I have to attend the debrief. If you're there, they'll sense something is wrong. He considered that, then nodded. I'll wait outside. Kira was grateful for that. As much as she wanted him close, his presence was overwhelming. Her senses were on fire already, his proximity only intensified it. She needed time to think, to plan, to understand what the bond had done to her and what it would do next. But when she stepped into the debriefing chamber an hour later, surrounded by her own people, she knew it was already too late. They could smell it on her. The room went silent as she entered. Commander Threx's gaze sharpened, his nostrils flaring subtly. He tilted his head, watching her with cold calculation. You're late, he said. My apologies, she replied, keeping her voice steady. The intake required more time than expected. Threx stared at her for a long moment, and then his eyes flicked to the others in the room. Dismissed. The officers filed out without question. Kira stood rigidly, her hands clasped behind her back, pretending she wasn't burning up inside. When they were alone, Threx stepped closer. Too close. She fought the urge to step back. You smell different, he said quietly. Kira's throat tightened. A reaction to the human pheromones. Threx's eyes narrowed. A bond. She said nothing. You have jeopardized everything, Threx snapped. Your position, your lineage, our people's future. It wasn't intentional, she said, though even to her ears it sounded weak. It doesn't matter, Threx hissed. The council will see this as betrayal. Kira's pulse pounded. She lifted her chin. I can still be useful. Not like this, Threx said. You're compromised. Then let me prove otherwise. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You will. But Kira left the debriefing chamber feeling like she'd just stepped off a battlefield. When she found Dane waiting in the corridor, his expression tense, she felt something loosen in her chest. No, she said. He nodded. What happens now? Or we run, she said simply. Or we fight. Dane's smile was grim. I'm good at both. Her bond flared at his words, and for the first time, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. They would survive this. Together. Kira paced the narrow confines of the quarters Dane had been assigned, her boots falling softly against the metallic flooring. Her mind churned with possibilities, each one more dangerous than the last. Outside, the faint hum of the ship's engines provided a steady background noise, but it did little to soothe the storm brewing inside her. Dane sat on the edge of the low bunk, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped loosely together. His green eyes followed her every movement. He wasn't impatient. He never was. But there was a quiet intensity about him that made her pulse race in ways that had nothing to do with her body's ongoing changes. They're going to come for me, she said finally, her voice low but sharp. It's only a matter of time before Threx tells the council. Dane tilted his head. What happens then? Kira stopped pacing. She turned to him, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. They'll try to separate us, to sever the bond. Is that dangerous? A humorless laugh escaped her lips. For me? Yes. For you. She shook her head. You wouldn't survive it. His jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. Then we don't let them try. Kira's gaze softened slightly. It's not that simple. My people, they view this bond as sacred, but between a Xerath and a human, she shook her head again. They'll see it as corruption, an infection. Dane stood then, crossing the space between them in 2 strides. His hands came to rest on her shoulders, firm but gentle. "You don't believe that?" She met his eyes, her throat tightening. "No, I don't." But they do. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, weighted with unspoken fears and desperate hope. "We need a plan," Dane said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Kara nodded slowly. "There's an old research station on the edge of the system, abandoned. No patrols. We could hide there." "For how long?" Dane asked. Her shoulders sagged. "I don't know." He let out a breath, his fingers tightening on her shoulders briefly before releasing her. "Then we make a run for it. Tonight." Kira blinked. "Tonight?" "They're already suspicious," Dane said. "And you said yourself they won't wait long." She hesitated, then nodded again. "Okay, we'll leave tonight." They spent the next several hours preparing. Dane gathered what little supplies he had. A few rations, his weapon, a comm device, and Kira secured the codes they would need to bypass the ship's internal security systems. Every move they made was careful, calculated. But Kira couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. By the time they were ready, her nerves were stretched taut. She stood at the viewport, staring out at the swirling expanse of stars, and tried to calm herself. Dane approached quietly, his presence a steady warmth at her back. "Okay?" he asked. She turned to him, her lips quirking in a faint smile. "No, but I will be." He nodded, his expression serious. "Let's move." They slipped through the corridors unnoticed, Kira's clearance codes allowing them to avoid the main patrol routes. They spoke little, relying on hand signals and instinct. Kira marveled at how quickly Dane adapted, his movements precise and efficient. He was a soldier, through and through. By the time they reached the shuttle bay, Kira's heart was pounding so hard she was sure Dane could hear it. She keyed in the access code, and the small transport's hatch hissed open. They moved quickly, stowing their gear and prepping the launch sequence. And that's when the alarm sounded. "Damn it," Kira hissed, fingers flying over the controls. "They've found us." Dane grabbed his weapon, moving to cover the hatch. "How long?" "Not long enough," she muttered. "Get ready." The first blast rocked the shuttle, sending a shudder through the deck. Kira cursed, stabilizing the ship's systems even as the hatch buckled under the assault. "They're boarding," Dane said, his tone grim. Kira glanced at him. "Hold them off. I just need 2 more minutes." He nodded once, his eyes hardening. 2 minutes. The next few moments were a blur. Kira worked frantically, fingers flying over the controls, while Dane held the line at the hatch. The first soldier through the door was met with a burst of plasma fire, his body crumpling to the deck. Dane moved like a predator, precise and lethal. But there were too many of them. "No, Kara!" Dane shouted. She hit the final sequence, the shuttle's engines roaring to life. The force field snapped up over the hatch, sealing them. Dane stumbled back, breathing hard, his weapon smoking. "Strap in." Kira barked. He obeyed without question, dropping into the co-pilot's seat just as Kira punched the thrusters. The shuttle lurched forward, tearing free from the docking clamps. Alarms blared as they blasted out of the bay, enemy fire streaking past them. "Shields holding," Dane reported, his fingers flying over the console. Kira nodded, her focus absolute. Plotting a course to the research station. The stars streaked past them as they jumped to light speed, the sudden silence in the cockpit deafening after the chaos of their escape. Kira slumped back in her seat, her breathing ragged. "We made it," Dane said after a moment. Kira closed her eyes briefly, then nodded. For now, they traveled in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Kira kept glancing at Dane, watching the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. He was always so calm under pressure, but she could feel the storm beneath the surface. Their bond made it impossible not to. "We'll be safe at the station," she said quietly. "At least for a little while." Dane glanced at her, his gaze softening. "And after that?" She shrugged, forcing a smile. "Whoa, survive." He reached over, his hand covering hers. The contact sent a jolt through her, their bond flaring hot and bright. She squeezed his hand, drawing strength from the connection. When they finally dropped out of light speed, the station loomed ahead, dark silhouette against the stars. It was old, its exterior pitted and scarred, but it would serve their purpose. Kira piloted the shuttle into the docking bay with practiced ease. They disembarked quickly, weapons ready, but found no signs of life. The station was truly abandoned. They secured the bay, then moved through the station, checking systems and establishing a base. It was slow work, but necessary. By the time they were done, exhaustion pulled at Kira's limbs. They collapsed on the floor of what had once been a crew lounge, their backs against the wall. Dane handed her a ration pack, and she took it gratefully. "Not exactly fine dining," he said with a wry smile. Kira chuckled softly. "I've had worse." They ate in silence for a while, the simple act grounding them both. When they finished, Kira leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes. "What now?" Dane asked. She opened her eyes, turning her head to look at him. "No, we figure out how to live with this." He reached over, brushing his fingers along her jaw. "I'm okay with that." She smiled faintly. Men too. Their bond pulsed between them, strong and steady. It was a strange comfort, knowing they were no longer alone. Later, as they lay side by side on the cold metal floor, Kira found herself reaching for Dane again. Their fingers intertwined, and she felt his warmth seep into her. "We'll be okay," he murmured. She believed him. For the first time in her life, she believed. The stars blurred into streaks of light as the small shuttle tore through hyperspace, its engines humming steadily. Kira sat in the co-pilot's chair, her gaze fixed on the readings as if sheer willpower could keep the system stable. Across from her, Dane adjusted controls with practiced ease, his focus unwavering even after hours in flight. The tension between them was different now. It wasn't born of mistrust or fear, but something more potent. A sense of shared purpose. They had come too far, risked too much, to second-guess the path they were on. And now, as they neared the ancient sanctum on Xeris, Kira's ancestral homeworld, she could feel something deep inside her stirring, a sense of belonging and dread. Approaching Exipone announced, his voice steady. He glanced at her, his green eyes catching the faint glow of the consoles. "Ready." Kira nodded, though her pulse was anything but calm. "Ready." The ship dropped out of hyperspace with a gentle lurch, the swirling vortex dissolving into the velvet black of normal space. Ceres loomed ahead, its pale, mist-wrapped surface dotted with ruins that had stood untouched for millennia. Kira exhaled slowly. It had been years since she'd set foot here, longer since she'd believed she ever would again. "It's beautiful," Dane murmured, his voice softer now. She looked at him and saw the awe in his eyes, the wonder that humans so often carried when confronted with things their people hadn't built or conquered. It softened something in her chest. "Once, all of this was alive," she said. "Temples, cities, forests stretching beyond sight. Now it's only ghosts." He reached across the console, his fingers brushing hers. "Then let's give it something new." Their hands lingered for a moment before returning to their tasks. Dane piloted the shuttle into the thin upper atmosphere with precision, guiding them toward the ancient coordinates Kira had input hours earlier. The Sanctum of Illyric, a place of legend, said to be where the oldest of her people communed with the stars and shaped destinies. As they approached, Kira's stomach nodded. She had always believed in her people's history, even when it had failed her. But this was different. This wasn't faith, it was survival. They landed at the edge of a sprawling ruin, its spires and arches worn smooth by time and neglect. Vines with silvered leaves clung to ancient stones, their roots sinking into cracks left by centuries of abandonment. A thick mist swirled through the air, muffling sound and light alike. Dane secured the ship, slinging his rifle over his shoulder before joining Kira at the hatch. She checked the charge on her sidearm, even though she doubted weapons would help them here. There were older forces at work in this place. "Stay close," she said. "Always," he replied. They stepped out together into ruins, the air cool and faintly metallic against their skin. Kira led the way, her feet finding ancient paths she hadn't walked since she was a child. The deeper they moved into the sanctum, the heavier the air became, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "What exactly are we looking for?" Dane asked quietly. Kira hesitated. "A sanctuary. A place of protection for those of royal blood and their bondmates." His gaze flickered. "So I'm officially your bondmate now." She gave him a wry smile. "After everything we've been through, you think you're still an outsider?" "I'd like to hear you say it." She stopped, turning to face him fully. The mist coiled around them as she stepped close, her fingers finding his. "You are my bondmate. In every way that matters." His eyes darkened with something deeper than desire. An understanding. He nodded once. Then lead on, princess. They continued in silence, Kira's senses straining for any sign of danger or hope. After an hour of weaving through the ruins, they found it. A narrow archway carved with sigils that glowed faintly under their touch. Kira pressed her palm against the stone, feeling the ancient bio lock react to her genetic code. There was a faint hum, then a low grinding as the wall before them slid open. A passage revealed itself, sloping downward into darkness. Dane activated a wrist light, the beam cutting a narrow swath through the gloom. Together they descended, their footsteps echoing faintly in the stillness. At the bottom, the tunnel widened into a vast chamber. A domed ceiling rose above them, glittering with embedded crystals that reflected the faint glow of the walls. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface smooth and unmarked. Kira approached slowly, reverence guiding her movements. "This is it," she whispered. "The heart of Illyri." Dane stayed close, his presence a steady anchor. "What do we do?" Kira extended her hand, placing it over the pedestal. The surface warmed beneath her touch, sending a pulse of energy through her body. The bond between her and Dane flared brightly, a rush of shared emotion and memory flooding them both. She heard his breath catch, felt his fingers tighten on her arm. Then the room changed. A web of light sprang up from the pedestal, casting intricate patterns across the chamber. Holographic images flickered to life, ancient battles, long-forgotten ceremonies, and the faces of those who had stood here before them. Among them, Kira saw her mother younger and smiling. Her throat tightened. "The sanctum recognizes us," she said. "It sees the bond." Dane nodded, though his eyes were wide. "It's incredible." As the images faded, a voice filled the chamber, soft, musical, and old beyond measure. "You have come seeking sanctuary. You carry the legacy of Illyri in your blood and the future of your kind in your bond." Kira's knees nearly buckled, but she held firm. "Yes." "Then you shall be judged." The air thickened, energy crackling around them. Kira's heart pounded as she braced for what was to come. Dane stepped closer, his hand finding hers again. Together they faced the test. A sphere of light enveloped them both, searing hot and blinding bright. Pain lanced through Kira's body, not physical but emotional. Memories of loss, failure, and guilt all dredged up at once. She saw Dane's past too, his battles, his regrets, his fears. They stood exposed, raw and vulnerable, their deepest selves laid bare before the sanctum's judgment. But through it all, they held on to each other. Dane's voice cut through the pain, steady and sure. "We are not perfect, but we are stronger together." Kira echoed him. "We choose this bond, freely." The sphere pulsed once, then dissolved into gentle light. The chamber brightened and the voice returned, softer now. "You have passed. Welcome, heirs of Illyri." A doorway opened in the far wall, revealing a smaller chamber beyond. Inside, a pool of liquid light shimmered invitingly. Kira stepped forward, Dane beside her. "This is the core," she said softly. "It will protect us." As they approached, the light swirled upward, surrounding them both. Kira felt warmth flood her body, soothing old wounds and knitting their bond even tighter. She heard Dane's sigh of relief, saw the tension ease from his shoulders. When the light faded, they stood changed, stronger, unified. Kira turned to him, her heart full. "We did it." He smiled, the kind of smile that made her breath hitch. "Yeah, we did. They returned to the surface, the sanctum ceiling behind them. As they climbed back into their shuttle, Kira felt hope for the first time in months. They had sanctuary now, a place to regroup, to plan. But more than that, they had each other. The flight back to the station was quiet, comfortable. Dane sat beside her, their hands occasionally brushing. There was no need for words. Their bond spoke volumes. When they landed, it was to the news they had expected. The council was escalating their pursuit. Rumors of their bond had spread, igniting both fear and curiosity. War was on the horizon, but Kira was no longer afraid. They spent days preparing. The sanctum had granted them new strength, but they needed allies. They reached out quietly to those who might listen. Rogue commanders, disenfranchised nobles, even old enemies who might see the benefit of a new alliance. And slowly people began to come. One night, as they stood on the observation deck watching the stars, Dane slipped his arm around her waist. "Do you think we can really change things?" She leaned into him. "I do. We've already started." He kissed her then, slow and deep, their bond pulsing with shared purpose. When they parted, his smile was soft. "Then let's finish what we started." And they did. Over the following months, their alliance grew. Kira led with strength and compassion, while Dane's tactical genius secured their victories. Together, they forged a new path for both their people. Eventually, the council was forced to acknowledge them. They stood before it not as fugitives but as leaders. Kira's mother, matriarch Varela, looked at them with something like pride. "You have changed our future," she said. Kira nodded. "For the better." As they left the council chamber hand in hand, Kira knew their journey was far from over. But with Dane at her side, she was ready for whatever came next. And together they built a future where love was stronger than fear and unity more powerful than division. Forever bondmates, forever united.